So in the last part of section 7.2, I want to talk just a little bit about the cell membrane. Now, in the previous recording and in the lessons the other day, I spoke a little bit erroneously. There will be a little tiny bit on membranes, but only what's included in the presentation right here and in the reading in section 7.2. 7.3 and 7.4 will be about the cell membrane, but it's going to be more about the details of how the cell membrane works specifically. So in 7.2, they kind of talk just about introducing the cell membrane and its structures and a little bit about its function. But sections 3 and 4, which we'll talk about later, it won't be on the test, we'll get into more specifics. So what is the cell membrane? The cell membrane is the outer boundary of a cell. Basically, it's what we call a selectively permeable membrane. It means basically that it decides what enters and what leaves the cell. How it does that, we're going to be looking at in more detail in chapter 7.3 and 7.4. In this particular section, we're going to concentrate more on the structure of the cell membrane and the components of it and the mosaic model of the cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane is composed of 2 layers of phospholipids. This is a phospholipid right here. We call it a phospholipid bilayer. Bi, of course, meaning 2, because there are 2 sets of these phospholipids butt up to each other, I guess is how you'd say it. This, on the right-hand side, is a phospholipid. The head is the phosphate, and then the tail, the section I just circled here, is made of fatty acid. So you can see the combination of the word phospho and then lipid. Phospholipid. This is what it looks like, kind of like a cross-section image. You can see the 2 layers, why it's called a bilayer, and you can see that they're tail to tail with the head out on each side. And look at that, 7 nanometers wide, very, very tiny. Okay. Now there's a couple words I want to introduce you to. Okay, the first word is hydrophilic. Okay, the head of the phospholipid is hydrophilic, and of course the word philic means it likes. Hydrophilic means it likes water. Whereas on the other end, the tail section is hydrophobic. And of course, phobic meaning it doesn't like or hating, water hating. So the tail section, of course, is hydrophobic. The head section, hydrophilic. Now, this view of the cell membrane is kind of looked at in almost like an artistic sense. It's called the fluid mosaic model. And it's called a fluid mosaic model because it looks like a mosaic. And I'm sure you've learned about mosaics in our class. Look at this mosaic here. On the left-hand side, you can see all kinds of different stones and stuff put together to create this beautiful work of art. And then if you look at the diagram on the right, you can see the cell membrane has that mosaic kind of appearance. However, instead of stones and pieces of glass and ceramic, whatever thing, clay like that, the cell membrane contains other structures like the phospholipid bilayer, and then all different types of proteins that are embedded in the membrane. And all these different proteins have very important jobs. And these are the things we'll be concentrating on in sections 7.3 and 7.4. But you can get a good understanding by looking at this picture why it's called the fluid mosaic model, because it's like a mosaic. Now, what are some of the jobs of some of those proteins that we're going to be looking at in section 7.3 and 7.4? Some of the proteins serve as ID markers. Some are transport proteins that facilitate the movement of material in and out of the cell. Some act as enzymes. We talked about that in the last chapter. Some act as fibers and points for the cytoskeleton to attach to. Let's look at it a little more closely on the next slide. Here's kind of a picture of some of these things here. You can see the transport channel facilitating the movement of material into the cell. You can see how the material is moving from high to low concentration. That'll be what we'll be talking about in the upcoming sections. You can see in the next image here, the protein acting as an enzyme to facilitate some type of reaction. Some are cell surface receptors, which can detect particles in the environment. Some are identity markers to indicate the identity of the cell or the structure of the cell. Some are used for adhesion, to attach a cell to cell. And some are location points for the attachment of the cytoskeleton that supports the cell. So that concludes what we're going to be talking about in the cell membrane for this particular section and for the test. Remember, look over section 7.2 and this presentation section for your information about the cell membrane And then in the last two sections, we're going to talk about how the cell membrane actually works.
All cells have an outer membrane, called a plasma membrane, which acts as a boundary between the outside and inside of a cell. Cell membranes are primarily made of phospholipids, which are large lipid molecules, similar to triglycerides. Like triglycerides, they contain glycerol and fatty acids, but they differ from triglycerides in that they have a phosphate group, rather than a fatty acid, attached to the third carbon of glycerol. The phosphate head of the molecule is hydrophilic, or water-loving. This means that it interacts well with water. The fatty acid tails, however, are hydrophobic, or water-hating, and do not interact well with water. Because of these unique properties, when placed in a liquid environment, phospholipids tend to arrange themselves into a phospholipid bilayer, so that only the hydrophilic heads interact with a watery environment, and the hydrophobic tails crowd inward, away from the water. The plasma membrane of a cell also contains other molecules that aid in its function. There are a number of different proteins embedded in a membrane, and they serve a variety of functions. Some are involved in the transport of substances across the membrane, while others help in cell-to-cell communication. Short chains of sugars are attached to the outer surface of some of these proteins, forming glycoproteins, which serve as recognition signals to other cells. Cholesterol is present in the membrane as well. Cholesterol lends support to the membrane and regulates fluidity, giving the membrane the general consistency of olive oil. The phospholipids, proteins, glycoproteins, and cholesterol are all present in the membrane as a flexible pattern, commonly referred to as the fluid mosaic model. Together, these components of the cell membrane allow the cell to interact with its external environment.